Welcome to EBA Day TV from Madrid. I'm here with Fred Beer and George Stein of VocaLink, together with two of their major customers, Simon Newstead from RBS and Michel Zaquin from HSBC. We're here to talk about the developments towards Sepa migration and in particular corporate services that will be provided. If I can turn to you, Simon, and Michel first of all. Corporates will have high expectations as banks move the market towards a Sepa environment. What types of corporate services do you expect to be delivering, and how do you think they'll develop as Sepa migration takes place?
Sure. Shall I begin? Okay. Well, from a corporate perspective, and rather unsurprisingly, our key focus is on account receivables and account payables, and how we can help our corporates get more efficient processes. So clearly Sepa has a significant part to play in that process, but it's a part. There are clearly one or two issues very familiar to us around preparing our corporate customers for Sepa, like BIC IBAN conversion, like the issues around mandate migration, etc. But efficiency of their account receivables and payables is key. So if you broaden out very slightly, you don't have to go that far from the core Sepa agenda to look into the digital agenda and e-invoicing in particular. So that's another very related topic where we're sort of looking at the Sepa angle, linking that to e-invoicing and seeing where there's potential to help our clients. And then the third element, I'd say, is if we look suddenly beyond Sepa, those corporate requirements for more efficient processing and greater standardization don't stop at the borders of the EU. So globally, the interesting question is how some of these same standards, how some of the same requirements are starting to be possible to be delivered in other areas.
Yes, I'm quite on the same lines. I would say that today, for global banks, it's one around, we know we're in the same format, same standards, so where is it going to play? It's going to be playing in recreating those legacy services customers already have. So they need to recognize that within Sepa, they're going to have those services delivered. So we're talking about things like reports, competitive cut-off times, multiple channels, and things like customer services for the representment, for example, of unpaid SDDs, which, for example, in the French market is a must-have. And I would say that beyond just recreating, so therefore giving them what they already know and have, is all the added value services. And I think, yes, one of the key questions is going to be migration. How are we going to help customers migrating? And how are we going to bring the right level of communication to our customers? And we understand that there's going to be a lot of communication going on around Sepa from government institutions and all kinds of actors. But I think the banks have a real role to play today with customers, don't you think?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think we've all been waiting for some certainty around the dates.
Exactly.
And clearly the Sepa regulation and the end dates, hopefully by around September, we will at last have that certainty. So I think that'll kind of unlock a whole raft of communication and a lot of sort of behavioural changes that I think everyone's in the whole market's been waiting for this moment.
This sort of phase working, and it's sort of now coming together. So I think it's really an interesting time, even if it's going to be quite challenging.
It will. And I think there's still one or two questions to be resolved around what exactly will our corporates have to move to, and what will they be required to do from a regulatory basis, as opposed to what the banking industry and other payment service providers will do. And back to helping corporates with their migration, one of the big questions clearly not yet resolved is around formats and the extent to which corporates will, I hope, have the opportunity and the right to use the XML standards in their interbank communications whenever they're ready to do so, as opposed to being forced to, which from my perspective is simply not a requirement. But we'll see what comes out.
Right, okay, thank you. Fred, can I bring you in there? Sounds like quite a challenge to help the major banks from a CSM perspective be connected to this growing world that we'll call the Sepa environment. What role do you see for the likes of VocaLink in this market?
Absolutely true. I mean, it rings very true that there will be a massive challenge. And clearly, even if we've been seeing it coming, we've been thinking about what role could we be playing. And we've actually been planning for 3 different areas where we felt we could add value to this migration project that the collective industry has to undertake. So the first was when the Sepa standards and rule books were being developed, there was clearly going to be a need for a CSM. There was one CSM in place, which was the EBA. We felt there would be room for more, and therefore we have developed a CSM service. That was the first that came live 2008, and that's been live ever since, and we're looking to expand that. There is the second area, which I think is actually starting to take more importance, which is generally value-added services, which would play between banks and their corporates. So mandate management services, payments capture services, payments authorization services, all of the pre and post processing. What we identified is that kind of service should be not tied in or packaged with other types of services, be able to serve the needs of different banks in different countries, where some of them may have very tight relationship with corporates, others may have more arm's length relationships in terms of the access, etc. So we've developed a suite of services as a managed service could be sold as a white label by a bank to help them bridge the gap. And I think the biggest hurdle really will be to, once the communication starts flowing, as you're anticipating as well, to really intensify with the pressure of the mandatory end dates on top. That's when the real activity has to start being developed. That's where those services fit. There is a third element which actually is more technical, but very much precedes everything else, which is just to be able to exchange all the different file formats. And here we have said we should need to develop a service which is able to just do any protocol, any format, any message type, be it Swift, be it EBIX, be it any local standard, to be able to put that in. That will probably be a temporary thing, think of 4 or 5 years, before the whole migration is done. But it's a service which I think will add a lot of value just by giving flexibility to planning cycles and to onboarding cycles, which will vary massively. So that's where we think our role will be. CSM, value-added services for the banks, and then connectivity between banks and corporates. And on top of that, the banks should be able to develop their own, recreate the services as Michel was indicating.
George, as a seasoned banker yourself, the connectivity sounds as though it's the big C in this particular debate. You've experienced migrations before, I'm sure. How do you see that evolving as Sepa develops and as you provide services to bring the corporates closer to their banks and vice versa?
It's interesting because having spent a lot of time working with corporates in the past and sort of keeping up with what's being discussed now, a lot of the issues that we saw 10 or even 15 years ago are still there. Where's my cash? Where's the information that I need to track things and make sure that everything's in the right place? So I see the move to Sepa fundamentally as a huge opportunity to increase visibility, to increase transparency, to achieve standardization, which is something that corporates have been screaming for almost as long as I've been in the business. And I think that our role or the role that we can play can help in a number of ways. To pick up on what Fred said, we can help banks better serve their corporate clients by moving banks from a space where I think a lot of banks are now, where they are compliant. They can process SEPA messages, but maybe aren't really ready for the volumes that we fully expect to transfer over to the SEPA environment. And also, as Fred mentioned, on the corporate side, if corporates need more time to move from legacy systems and legacy formats to the new SEPA world, we can help that transition phase and sort of ease the pain of the migration. So I see our role in working with our banking partners, but also working with corporates and indirectly helping our banking partners. So standardization will help everyone, ultimately.
Okay. back to the bankers, standardization tends to threaten, to some extent, revenues, particularly from, say, core payments as a mechanism. How do you see more advanced added value services coming in, say, cash management and liquidity, or real-time insight to, as George said, information?
Again, in these added value services and standardization, I think it's, obviously that's the direction it's all going to take. But at the same time, we are in a phase where, as bankers, we need to identify in what communities, what are the added value services that will make the difference and will belong to tomorrow's European payments industry, and those that are too specific. So I think there isn't a sort of basic answer. We're all going to be standard and it's all going to be great. It's going to be really, it's really going to be a question of what are those services that really make sense in any specific given market, and why we need to be in that market, because that's our customer base. Yes. And those that aren't our customer base, or not necessarily those that we're going to want to go to, we're all going to have to make those types of choices and adhere or not adhere to those choices. And then I think, to be quite honest, it's like saying that on the migration there's a migration path. No, there's not a migration path. There is a right migration path for your corporate base. Is it the SME? Then you need to be practical. What kind of local formats do you need to translate? If it's a major global player, he may want to rationalize because he wants to rationalize within Europe and outside of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to have the capacity to adapt, as always.
Yeah. And I think that there's a related point, which is about which are the right areas for standardization, and which are the right areas that you can say these are the ones for value-added competition. Because I think, there are some kind of concerning issues out there still in terms of, Fred was talking earlier about the services that VocaLink provide in the sort of helping, I guess, get over some of the pain points and move to the future. But what is the future from a standards perspective? We need kind of one version of the truth when it comes to ISO XML. At the moment, there are many versions of the truth. And that's not a harmonized Sepa outcome. And actually we shouldn't be, and that's we in a collective sense, shouldn't be trying to compete or protect actually by having lots of different versions of the standard we're meant to be moving to. And equally I think that there's clearly some very positive things that can be done by a community to help it's a national community to help its corporates or its citizens or its tax authorities move to the new Sepa environment. But where there's an issue, which is where those become sort of accidentally sort of barriers to cross-border competition because they're suddenly locked into the national environment. And I think that's where there's a big piece of work which is maybe now starting but needs to be completed, that says if we take the core Sepa schemes, SCT and SDD, there are, if you look around the national communities now, because migration now is clearly going to happen, this is for real, now is the time to do that gap analysis and say, what are the things, what are the barriers, what are the additional features that need to be introduced on a harmonized basis wherever possible into the Sepa schemes, and then get those central components right. And then I think competition will be truly unlocked, and that's when we as providers, whether that's banking providers or CSM providers, can truly start competing, can truly start innovating around our value-added services, but in a way that doesn't disturb the competitive and efficient model.
Okay. Fred, that sounds like a challenge for interoperability, and I know you played quite a personal role in making sure that Europe has, yes, communities that might be distinct in the way they operate, but they're actually connected and they do have these fundamental areas, etc. How do you see that developing as the starting gun is fired for the Sepa migration itself?
That's actually it's a very interesting point. I think the thinking about interoperability is still very much evolving, where initially it was felt that it was just connecting old legacy, especially in the CSM area, and therefore why bother, because it would all migrate to a peach or very one big. I think the the reality of the past 3-4 years is showing that there are other reasons why that consolidation and migration to one piece is not happening so quickly. And therefore, in a sort of inverse way, interoperability will become more important for the future. I'm going to talk about that in the general session as well, but I think it's a must, effectively, and it will be a very good solution where it will take a bigger role initially, and then probably its role will diminish as the other problems are being sorted out and there is less need to fix it through interoperability. Especially what you were saying, the tiny detailed differences, devil in the detail with the ISO XML implementations. That is something which I very much concur where you said that should be the time now or pretty soon to get that sorted before the migration starts for real. But that actually means there's only a window of about 18 months or so left to do that. And I would have a question for you, is to say, where would you see the initiative coming to start such a gap analysis and to take action? Would that be in the EPC working groups or?
I mean, there's a number of places it could happen. I mean, I think the most logical place would be the EPC to reach out, and some of this is happening. So it's not that this is an entirely new idea, but I think having a kind of a focused look as a minimum in each of the Eurozone countries, but actually I'm not sure I'd stop there, and look at things like how are tax payments made, how are pension payments made, how are salary payments made. That'd be a good place to start, because I know that in a number of countries those are seen as very different instruments with their own features, with their own fields.
They qualify for waivers, and they're
correct.
Potentially.
Well, either they end up qualifying for waivers, which doesn't feel like a good long-term solution, or actually maybe there's ways of doing these things in a more harmonised way. Now that's I'm not sure how practical it is to do all of that ahead of the migration end date to sort of clean up all of those different things. It's a massive ask to expect public authorities around Europe to suddenly harmonise all their practices. So we need to be realistic.
Well, that's why it's
but any moves we can make in that direction, but I think also as influencing what we can influence, which is our own behaviour, and making sure that the CSMs and the group that you're in, Fred, work together to try and make sure that we avoid the avoidable variations in standards. That's a very good thing to do too.
Yes, I'll take that.
No, yes, I would really agree with that. I think we're not going to be able to standardize and have a model in one go. So it's going to be really getting the right high-level vision of things and trying to adopt them. And it's coming from the base. And it's because we already see, for example, in certain countries, like in France, where the public administration and the social sphere is moving, the information will come from the ground, from the corporates, and this will give us the right level of visibility. And it is a partnership, it is the capacity to work together and to communicate, and probably through the EPC is the right way.
Yeah, so the EPCs then should gear up for a massive data collection, information collection and learning cycle for the next phase, if you like. During the migration, all these lessons will emerge. They'll have to be analyzed, structured and set which ones can be taken forward, which can be avoided, and then put on the agenda. And to actually implement that will be another cycle of 3-4 years at least.
And I think it's something where the Sepa Council has a role to play, because that brings together public sector, private sector, and within private sector, supply side and buy side. So I think there is a very valid role for the Sepa Council to start bringing some focus on some of these sort of topics, because it's only through a partnership approach, public-private sector, that we are ever going to be able to sort of resolve some of those more complex issues.
Simon, I think that's a great way to finish in terms of bringing the customer back in the room, making sure that the banks and their CSM partners work with ultimately the person it's in favour of, and you get the standardisation that SEPA deserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.